This is a production of Cornell University.
Welcome to the English Department's Books Sandwiched In event. Thank you so much for coming today to meet the newest faculty member in the English Department, Carol Warrior. Welcome, Carol. I am so excited to introduce her today. I'm not going to do one of those like formal academic introductions. I just want to say to you guys, this series, today's event is the last one of this year's series, but the series will continue next year with more talks by faculty, more informal free lunches, sometimes pizza, more career services showing up and giving the people who are willing to show up for such a thing a private, tailored just for you conversation about getting a job with an English major, all those kinds of things. We want to hear back from you about the stuff that worked for you about Books Sandwiched In and what you'd like to see more of. But the fact is we're excited about this program and it's going to keep going. So today, as our last event of the year, which sounds funny because it's only March, but then the weather gets even better and it becomes even harder to get people into a room at noon. So today is our last event of the semester of the year. I want to welcome Carol Warrior and say we're so happy to have her at Cornell.
Naha, Nanisa it, Carol Edelman Warrior, Ninana, Aaninen, Dinaina, Koniak Supiat. I just told you hello. My name is Carol Warrior, and these are my people. I'm happy to be here with you in beautiful Cayuga territory, where Cornell is situated, and to share with you what I've been doing, I guess, and what brought me here. I'm thankful to Masha for inviting me here to do this. I was very reticent at first. But I'm glad I'm here with you, sharing lunch. I hope you enjoy it. So what I do here in the Department of English and in my field of Indigenous literature and Indigenous studies is something that I had to talk about last year when I gave my job talk here. And before I walked up to this very podium to deliver that job talk, Eric Chaffetz, you might know who Dr. Chaffetz is. He introduced me. And one of the many things he said about me is that I'm an activist. And even though he said a lot of other wonderful things about my work, that was the only thing that made me blush. I think it's because I've always thought of activists as being self-sacrificial in a way, putting their reputations and their bodies on the line in the hope that their work will result in some kind of material or structural change that makes life and well-being possible. But I wonder why Dr. Chaffetz said that about me, because that's not how I self-identified in my letter or anything like that, and it's not a term I claim for myself. But then I remembered that one of my writing samples that I sent into the search committee was regarding the 2010 shooting of a First Nations woodcarver on the streets of Seattle. The shooter was a police officer, and his actions were part of a pattern of racialized violence that are in the Seattle Police Department. So I was involved in protests and vigils and rallies and marches and a lot of community meetings after that. And I was also involved in a lot of events that commemorated and honored the life of John T. Williams, the victim. In that writing sample, I became especially focused on some of the creative works that were produced by the community members after the shooting. They did a lot of poetry and music and theater productions, that kind of stuff. A lot of spoken word, murals, and I wrote about some of those things. My goals in writing that piece were to demonstrate that the poems and songs and carvings made after the shooting expressed a couple of things. One is resistance, of course, is outrage, and also they plainly claimed the victim as a relative, their relationship, or their relation, their relative, their brother. And they also made the argument that he was a valued person and that he would be missed. It was also my goal with this piece to uncover the social and systemic conflicts that led to the tragedy and that rupture in the community. And I guess things could have become ugly at any of those rallies or meetings and I was a little bit at risk. But, and then, yes, I realized later that I have been known to carry signs and walk in marches and stuff like that, write letters of protest, raise my voice in other ways when lives depend on radical change. And I've taught Indigenous literary activism. But still, wearing that label of activist is something that I haven't grown comfortable with. Perhaps we're not supposed to be comfortable with those kinds of things. But I think finding a voice and using it to protect life and well-being is important, and regardless of how that kind of action is named. But since this talk is meant to tell you about some of the experiences that led me to the field of Indigenous literary studies and critical Indigenous theory, and to the work I'm doing now, I need to tell you that that is an enormous story. That's too big for this context. It has many complicated twists and turns, so I'll just focus on how, for me, the goals of some forms of activism intersect with my work. To frame it all, I'd like to share some ideas from a novel that had a profound influence on the path that I chose as an academic, and specifically the topic of my dissertation, which is about fearsome figures in Indigenous literatures. And I'm now working on turning it into a book manuscript, tentatively titled, This Is How We Fought, Traditions of Resistance in Indigenous Speculative Fiction. So this novel I wanted to share, which is not what I'd call speculative fiction, is called Solar Storms. And it's by a Chickasaw writer, author, poet, Linda Hogan. I'm just going to give you some background on the story, and then I'll talk about some other things, and then come back to Solar Storms later. Again, this novel helped me generate the questions that led to my work. So there's a cover of the novel. Some of my students are here, and we just finished working on this novel. So the protagonist her name is Angel. She's been separated from her family and community, having been thrust in the foster system as a young girl. At 17 years old, she runs away from her last foster family, and she finds her way back home to her home community. She wears her hair hanging down over one side of her face, which is scarred and disfigured on that side, so she's hiding behind that veil. And she can't remember how she got those scars. But she does remember that it had something to do with her mother. The scars on her face and the repressed memory of how she became disfigured is an outward symbol of how her identity and her relationships were fractured and distorted, and in relationship with the land and in relationship to her mother. It's also an outward and later in the book, those themes are echoed by and connected to the scarring of the land. It happens in a lot of environmental devastation that happens, and that's the characters all become activists in that end of the book. So I guess as the land and features and their inhabitants become scarred, so do the characters. They're related. So when Angel first arrives back in her very rural hometown, and I picked up these pictures because that's kind of the environment we're talking about, in the Boundary Waters region between Minnesota and Canada, her mother has been gone from that community since Angel was taken away. But upon her return, Angel's welcomed and nurtured by 3 elder women in her family. Essentially her step-grandmother, her great-grandmother, and her great-great-grandmother, very old women. These women had tenaciously held on to the hope that Angel would someday return. And with their help, Angel begins the process of putting back together her fragmented sense of identity. This happens slowly and includes hearing all the stories about her family, her ancestors, and their relationships with the land, and how, I guess, the processes of colonialism has affected them. Throughout this process, every once in a while, her great-great-grandmother says, "I want to go home to die." And home for her was in the far north in Inuit territory. So Angel learned that her story not only reach back through the generations through time, but also through place and space as well. And on the process of storing her identity, of putting herself back together, Angel says, quote, "Beginnings were important to my people, as I would one day call them." And then her grandmother, Agnes, tells Angel, "Nobody knows where it began, your story. What happened to you started long ago. It began around the time when the killing of the wolves happened, when people were starving. I don't know where the beginning was, your story or ours. Maybe it came down in the milk of our mothers. Old man said it was in the train tracks that went through the land and came out of the iron mines. I've thought about this for years. It might have started with the crying children who were taken away from their mothers, or when the logging camps started and the cities were built from our woods, or when they cut the rest of the trees to raise cattle." End quote. So we learned from Agnes that the processes of colonization were integral to the contemporary circumstances of Angel's life. And why I wanted to point out this searching around for a beginning is because that's the struggle I had when I was trying to figure out what to throw out and what to include in this talk today, because the intellectual questions that motivated me to do the work that I do came through a number of different processes that I can't even begin to put together in a whole narrative at this point. And I couldn't figure out where the story began or when it began, because there were many, many beginnings. But I know it started a long, long time ago, long before I was born, and maybe even before my great-great-grandmother was born. So here's one of the threads of the story. It begins with a road trip that I took in around 1991 with my dad, my sister, and we drove from Seattle to Great Falls. We lived in Seattle. And we went there to visit my great Aunt Tilly, one of my grandmother's many siblings. And then from there, the four of us drove north a few hours to Fort Belknap in north central Montana, which is where my grandmother's family is from. It's a reservation. And as an aside, it's also the setting of this fantastic novel by James Welch. And it's where this film was shot, which was an adaptation of the film, and we'll be studying it next year in my class, Indigenous Representations in Film. So we'll be, just a little commercial there. It's a beautiful film and a wonderful book. So anyway, while we were there at Fort Belknap, we visited the tribal office to sort out some of the confusion surrounding my dad's land there. And we visited some family on the res and enjoyed a long, relaxing afternoon with some of my dad's cousins and aunts, one of the other aunts. She was one of the oldest members of the family, and she wasn't really aware what year it was or who we were at all. That day she confused us with people who were long gone, that she had known in her younger years. And so she sat in her rocking chair. She would sing and talk in Ani, which is the language of our ancestors in that side of our family. And even though none of us in the room there could understand her, we wished we could. And then at one time she said, in English, "Remember the dances we used to have at the roundhouse? Oh, we had so much fun." And then her feet would tap the floor as she could, to the music that only she could hear. And she remembered those good times from her younger days, and then we wished we could join her in those memories as well. I don't think any of us even remembered the roundhouse. Later that afternoon, we traveled to the southern part of the reservation toward the tiny town of Haze. And that's not a picture of Haze, but it's near there. Because my father wanted to visit some of the places he knew so well as a young person. And that's where his grandmother and aunts and cousins and uncles, that's where they lived. And he spent a lot of time with them there when he was growing up. And keep in mind that my dad is now in his late 80s, and my Aunt Tilly, if she was still with us, would be 106 years old right now. So that means that the people in the stories that my aunt was telling me were often from the pre-reservation period. So Aunt Tilly told me that after she got out of Chemawa, which was the Indian boarding school that she was sent away to in Oregon to essentially live and learn not to be Indian. That's what those schools are for. She went to live with her grandmother, my great-grandmother. Actually, no, my great-great-grandmother, because Tilly wanted to learn the language. She'd not been allowed to speak it in boarding school, and she wanted to recuperate that. So my great-great-grandmother's name was Stryker, or Strike. Tilly said that Strike was a very strong woman, and that after everyone was forced to live on the reservation, Strike refused to go. But she wanted to be close to the community. She wanted to be close to her family and close to people who spoke her language. So Aunt Tilly pointed out this place on the other side of this creek. It was a grassy area, a nice area, and on this side in the reservation was all rocky and kind of barren. So apparently Strike would pitch her teepee on the other side, on the pretty side, and stay there just across the boundary. Tilly told me she refused to be cooped up. But even later, when Tilly lived with her, every now and then they would have to pack up and head for a different spot to avoid the Indian agent or the priests. So to me, even these little anecdotes have amazing histories, amazing contexts, and those impel me to learn more about why that was. So anyway, that day, we checked on my dad's land and listened to my Aunt Tilly and my father tell stories about the different places we visited. Before heading home, though, my dad wanted to go see a special mountain in the Little Rockies, where he used to stay with his aunt and uncle for weeks at a time. In English, it's called Spirit Mountain. It's on the far left, and it's bigger than it appears in the photo just because of the perspective. And it was a special place where people would go for fasts and for other ceremonies and to gather choke cherries and other medicines and to bury their beloved dead. Anyway, I was excited to go there because I'd heard so many stories about it, but Aunt Tilly warned my father, "You won't recognize it." Eventually, my dad rolled the car to a stop and just sat there really quiet. And Aunt Tilly was silent too. So I looked to the distance to see what had silenced them. And I saw something I really couldn't make any sense of at all. I asked, "What is that?" And Aunt Tilly said, "Well, it's the mine." I had seen entrances to mines before, hiking in the woods. You see a little closed area, an old door or something like that, and a sign saying an abandoned mine, danger. But that's nothing like what had appeared before us. I said, "Where's the mountain?" And my aunt says, "That's it, or what's left of it." What she gestured to was something like an enormous ziggurat, and we were back further. It's much bigger than what this photo can convey, but what I was seeing was all these multiple levels and this pyramid-shaped thing and little trails of dust, which were being, what really that were trucks. And I thought, well, maybe those were pickup trucks, after my aunt said that they were trucks. But then later I realized that those trucks were enormous. Every tire is 13 feet tall. And they can haul about 345 tons of material in a single load. And then that material would be treated with a solution of cyanide and other toxins, which would pull the gold out of the ore. And at the height of its production, this mine, it would only produce about an ounce of gold for every 100 tons removed. So, worth it. But then the leftover ore would turn green and leach acid into the streams and creeks nearby. And that's not even taking into consideration the dozen or so spills that happened there, including one that released over 50,000 gallons of cyanide solution that contaminated the community's drinking water supply and many of the creeks that ran into the lower prairie. including the one that runs right through the ceremonial grounds and right through my dad's property. If animals drink from it, they get poisoned and die, or they give birth to deformed offspring. So Spirit Mountain was irreparably scarred and fragmented. Its former meaning and relationships are now irreparably crushed. That experience changed me. I can't express the despair that overcame me as I contemplated the countless relationships ruptured because of that mine. I suppose people are kind of desensitized these days to that kind of loss, because we do see images of strip mines pretty frequently, especially on social media, I think. But it's more, to us, it's more than just a mountain or some water. Anyway, so there we were looking at what used to be Spirit Mountain, and we sat there in silence for some time. And eventually my dad said, "That's it then." And he headed the car back to Great Falls. It was a very quiet ride. We finished up our visit a few days later and returned to Seattle, but this experience made me want to understand where such an appetite comes from, because I looked at it as eating kind of a thing, eating of the natural world, and how people resist it, both in terms of policies and practices. I wanted to find out how people's ideas and values about this kind of consumption are generated and perpetuated. What would someone have to believe to desire this kind of desecration, I thought. Eventually, I told my other sister about that experience, and she responded by giving me a copy of another book that further impelled me on this path. The book by Peter Mathiasson is called In the Spirit of Crazy Horse. Excuse me. I read it with a frenzy. It's a long and difficult book that devotes a lot of attention to the legal trouble faced by the members of the American Indian movement, activists, in the 1970s and 80s, and focuses on the circumstances that led to the now 40-year incarceration of Leonard Peltier, who was one of the members of the American Indian movement. But the aspect of that book that was most influential to me was the historical linkages it made between the processes of colonialism and the contemporary circumstances of Native peoples, policies and practices that similarly led to what happened at Spirit Mountain. It provided the contextual information that I needed to know, stuff that I never learned in U.S. history. It answered questions like, how did we lose our land? How were reservations created? Why did my grandparents have to go to boarding school? Why were things like indigenous religious practices and languages made illegal? Learning about the systematic losses our family and other indigenous people had been subjected to, I began to get, I guess, motivated and maybe a little angry or resentful. And unlike Nietzsche, I think resentment toward injustice is a very healthy thing. For me, it provided motivation to learn more and to disrupt the ideas and actions that lead to the kind of fractures that I was seeing. And over the next years, I attended community college part-time. And at one point, I took a linked environmental and literature course. And that was when I was first introduced to Linda Hogan's Solar Storms. Out of approximately 60 students, I was the only one in the class who identified as Native. And the two instructors, by their own admission, were not specialists in Native literature or cultural studies or what Native people have experienced or their worldviews. They really had no familiarity at all. So as I read, the images evoked by solar storms, they haunted me. They depicted the same scarring of land and people that I'd witnessed, that I'd experienced. And the prose often connected these events to images of what seemed to be a voracious, hungry kind of spirit or something like that, an energy with sharp, gnawing teeth. And the text really only described this energy by what it does, not what it looked like or anything like that, not what it was. Never named it. So through the actions of characters, inspired by that energy, or for lack of a better word, the landscape and everything whole and beautiful in that area was consumed until only fragments and traces remained. Let's see. Should be another slide in here, but it's missing. So the destruction that Linda Hogan depicts is based on the Manitoba Hydroelectric Project that in real life radically altered Manitoba's landscape and the lives of First Nations people in Canada and really everything that inhabited those places. It was to jumpstart Manitoba's economy and create electricity. But to do so, the rivers that already flowed there were corralled, combined, and sometimes even reversed in direction. Places where people had long histories and relationships were inundated. Villages, breeding grounds for moose and elk, special places where people would go to collect medicines when someone was ill. They were devastated. The people were devastated too. They all had to relocate. And their way of life was changed. They could no longer hunt or fish. So these depictions, they resonated with me, in part because, again, of what I had seen and experienced at Fort Belknap. So, fast forward to when I was in graduate school, studying historical materialism and post-colonialists and Freud and Fanon and Foucault and every other important idea maker that we're forced to intellectually ingest, I guess, and wrestle with. That vision of voracious teeth that grew out of my reading of solar storms, it just was still there, and I couldn't see anybody really getting at it. They were kind of seeing parts of it, but it didn't seem like it held up. So I eventually described this image of solar storms to my partner, who's an Anishinaabe scholar. He's an anthropologist. And he immediately said, that sounds like Wendigo. It's a cannibal monster from a lot of old Algonquian stories. And you should probably look into it if you ever want to write about solar storms or, or teach it or anything. So I did. And that's when I got started on the research that ended up in my dissertation and is inspiring my current book project. And then soon after that, soon after that, I found that Lenape historian Jack D. Forbes had published a book in 1992 called Columbus and Other Cannibals, the Wetiko Disease of Exploitation, Imperialism, and Terrorism. And in its pages, he argues that the evolution of the Wetiko or Wendigo figure from Algonquian oral narratives represents the disease of empire, of terrorism, and exploitation of all kinds. So to understand this, first of all, you should probably know that traditionally, the Wendigo figure is an insatiable, ravenous being, one that's often associated with cold, ice, blinding snowstorms, so it disorients people, who hungers only for human flesh. It kind of paralyzes people too. It's much more complicated than that, but I guess that's really all you need to know for now. But what Forbes did with this figure is this. He drew on a figure from traditional oral narratives of his people. Lenape people are an Algonquian people, by the way. And he came up with a theory to understand what's been happening to our world and to humanity for a very long time, and to our world, our planet, through humanity's disease. And he theorized that the world is suffering from this disease, which he calls Wetikoism. In his theory, it's not an actual Wendigo that he's talking about. He's making a comparison between the conduct of any kind of expansionistic consumption, and especially consumption of lives and land in every kind of way that there is. And as it turns out, I found out later that a lot of Indigenous authors, musicians, and artists have been basing the villains in their creative works on this figure for a long time. I just didn't recognize it. A lot of scholars have also written about this figure's meaning as it appears in Native literature. And it's interesting reading, and it's always very theoretical. And in some ways, that kind of comparison is what I do in my work as well. And like Forbes and other scholars, I think it's what the Wendigo does that's most important, and not whether or not it appears like an authentic replica of the figure from the old stories. What it does is it consumes lives, and it deceives people. It paralyzes them, and does so in very many ways. It has lots of shape-shifting kinds of tricks. And it can also make people feel so cold and disoriented and alone that they'll destroy their own relationships. It like confuses them, makes them think they're seeing something that they're not. And a lot of indigenous writers create Wendigos or Wendigo-like villains that reduce everything on the planet to something consumable, like mountains and gold, for example. So, let's see. Let's leave that there. So being that Forbes already theorized the pathology and virulence of Witikoism, and since I'm not at all the first scholar in this field to recognize or write about how Wendigoism is present and traceable in the villains that indigenous writers create, what I add to that conversation is a close look at how indigenous speculative fiction draws on the traditional stories to construct not only their antagonists, like the Wendigo, but also the strategies for fighting them and other Wendigo-like villains. I make the claim that these strategies are drawn, in some cases, from the ways that the old people fought certain fearsome figures of the past and have talked about in their oral narratives. So at its heart, I guess my current work is inspired by indigenous resistance movements in the same way that a lot of indigenous aesthetic works are. So to connect my work to indigenous activism, the literatures and critical theories I write about and share with my students can and have inspired many people to fight for life and well-being, and then to do so through restorative acts that change the way we view the world. I guess to do so in ways that respect and care, that offer respect and care for the systems that sustain life and that need to continue without humans mediating them and destroying their ability for that interrelationship to continue. While this certainly doesn't encompass or characterize everything that I do in my scholarship, I think indigenous literature, especially contemporary indigenous literatures, are always political kind of in that way and resistant in some way to the destruction of life and to those scars on the land and on the people. And they're concerned always with the misuse of power. I can't really think of any contemporary Native literature that doesn't concern that in some way. So the experiences that I've shared with you, that is my engagement with specific communities and my responses to certain texts, the experience of learning about my family stories, and of course, Spirit Mountain. These are just examples of how experience in literature can combine and result in a set of intellectual and even ethical or spiritual considerations and questions. So I guess what the point of all of this is to say that through the process of my research and my experiences, I've made all these different connections between land and the stories we tell about ourselves. And those connections, that's what's been activated. I guess that's the activism part. Those connections have been activated. Those are all relationships. And I hope that when my students read Native literature, they can be moved to make connections with things that are happening in their own lives and what they see in the world as well. So that's it then. Okay. I don't mind. If anybody has any. Yeah.
All right. So in the American education system from K to 12, we really only talk about Native Americans and their like struggles and the injustices, and First Nations people and like basically all other natives of any other country are very rarely mentioned. Do you feel like just understanding Native Americans and their struggles gives us at least enough to understand the similar situations of other natives, or is it important to learn more about the natives of other countries?
Well, I think that it's always important to learn about, I guess, injustice, all right, and colonialism, the processes of colonialism, which always involves, the expropriation of land, first and foremost, always. And so that process still continues here in the United States, and is very similar to what's happened, I suppose, in Canada, in Australia, in New Zealand, and well, all over actually. But I think those countries, some of those countries, have a really a similar relationship to the people who are, I guess. We haven't gone through a process of decolonization, is what I want to say. So it's important to learn about the indigenous peoples in those places, because their conditions are a little bit different from indigenous peoples in nations that have already gone through that very violent, sometimes, process of decolonization. I think that the relationship between colonizer and colonized in the United States with Native Americans, you can begin to give you an understanding of what's going on, say, like in the Pacific Islands or Australia or New Zealand. But I wouldn't say that it's ever enough to limit yourself to one particular nation state's indigenous peoples. I mean, we're talking about, like, in the United States, 556 federally recognized tribes. There are many more that are unrecognized. That's just the United States. And it doesn't include Canada's people. Same thing, many, many, many people. So the diversity is already here. So if you wanted to study Native American literature or the conditions, their relationship with colonizers, it would be a great place to start for sure. It would give you an idea to what's happening in other places as well. Like, I'm sorry if I'm answering too long, but we just watched the movie The Rabbit-Proof Fence. Anybody seen that film? It's a great, it's on Netflix. It's a film about a couple of Aboriginal three young ladies, children, who were stolen from their family and put into a boarding school in Australia to acculturate them and assimilate them into white society in Australia. So, I mean, these processes that Native people have undergone here are similar in all these other colonized spaces as well. So.
I'm going to piggyback on something you said.
Okay.
No one else has that question. You mentioned the term decolonization.
Mm-hmm.
What exactly do you mean by that?
What I mean by that, that's a huge question in the field. We have conversations about this all the time. And I can only really speak for myself because people have different ideas of what they want. In some ways, in many ways, a lot of it is like, okay, for example, some people are really insistent that they want their treaties to be upheld. The stolen land that they agreed to keep, but was to be allowed to be on and to hold as their own sovereign space. Even that's been taken away in chunks and through many different policies. So they want that back for sure. And then there's people who want they want relationships with the land to be restored, whether that concept of ownership has to change or not. that's a question. I mean, because the idea of ownership of property, of course, is a construct, something that's made up, that we are all dealing with. So I think talking about that and maybe changing the way we think about what ownership and property is something that's on people's hearts and minds as well. I could talk about that for a long time, but I don't know. Did that help at all? Okay. Any other questions? Yeah.
I'm wondering if you found any figures like Wendigo that are counterpart to Wendigo, so like a positive counterpart or a foil or something like that in the mythology and the religion.
A positive counterpart. Well, I don't think that those.
Something that counteracts what Wendigo does.
Well, I mean, that's why I'm looking at the like how people fought them, right?
Yes.
So, I mean, I suppose trickster figures like Wolverine or sometimes Coyote or animals in the mythical times. Those sorts of eras. Sometimes they were called upon to take on a Wendigo, or they would do so by, they would be begged to do that, and so they would decide, okay, I'll make myself really small and I'll let him or it swallow me. And then while I'm inside, when they're inside, then they jab the heart, kill him, They're, these really fun, kind of interesting stories. But I mean, even that's sort of an allegory, or you can think of that as, okay, well, so that means, what does it mean to go into the belly of the beast like that? I mean, and obviously these aren't, stories or ideas about fighting from the inside are in many people's stories, but that's one. Yeah, Greg.
How do you find speculative fiction and what draws you to it? Just thinking I'm in the middle of teaching like the English canon, and so that involves Scholars' Travels. It involves a lot of speculative fiction in those English origins being explicitly tied to colonial expansion. I'm just wondering what native speculative fiction does and how you define it.
Okay, so what does native speculative fiction do? Like what kinds of things it does? A number of things. One thing that's really important is that it counteracts the idea of the vanishing Indian, a lot of times through sci-fi, because we're in the future and we're not the objects of, we're not the aliens that become invaded, like, with Star Trek, or, and we're also not, taking on that role of invader either. It's a like surviving, thriving thing. Another thing that happens that I really enjoy about indigenous speculative fiction, especially the futurism, is that it draws on a lot of the worldviews and what we can call religious practices, but they're just ways of being, I guess, and then combine them with different technologies to be able to still, fight oppression or to live in a new place, in a new environment or new conditions that are created through whatever imaginary world they're in. One of the other, let's see, what else do they do? They often, sometimes with speculative fiction, we'll get a rewritten history. So we'll get an alternate history where, the Indians won. Or where there's some sort of a relationship that's devised between colonizer and colonized that ends up not being a relationship of dominance and subordination. And I think it's really fun. Like I write about some of the indigenous vampire stories, so it's really fun to see how vampires get indigenized. And other figures that are not native, from native oral traditions. I could go on about that, but yeah, there's quite a few cool things that happens.
A follow-up question. One of the
Yeah.
things we usually ask the book sandwich and speakers to recommend a book for people to read that they might want to read for fun.
I wish I had known about that.
Oh.
That's okay. But I'm going to give you the name of the book that my students are about to read. It's called The Way of Thorn and Thunder, and it's by Daniel Heath Justice, who's a Cherokee writer and a professor at University of British Columbia. And it will especially appeal to people who are a little bit on the nerdy side, I think, and really like things like Dungeons and Dragons or fantasy, because the characters in the book are based on these D&D characters that Dan had as a kid, growing up through his years, when he was gaming. And then, so yeah, it's a really awesome book, and it's an omnibus version of 3 separate novels that he wrote, and so it's a completely different world. It's very much in the tradition of Tolkien, but you can see the traces of the Cherokee relocation in it as well.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.